Hello everyone, Dell here, and this presentation is about a couple of elements of art and a principle of art that will be important both for some of your homework and for your next project. These are line, space, and movement. We'll begin today talking about line. You probably remember that we've discussed line a little bit in previous classes, but we'll delve much more into what this is and what it can do. Line is one of our elements of art and design, so it's one of those building blocks that you can draw on a piece of paper, paint on a canvas in order to build up your composition. We typically define line in art as the path of a point moving in space. So if you think about your pencil point, if you put that on a paper surface and then you move it around, it will leave a trail behind it, a path, and that path is a line. We typically consider lines in art to be one-dimensional, at least in theory. Of course, in practice, if you draw a line on a piece of paper, you could take a ruler and you could measure the width of that, but the width is really nominal compared to its length. Lines are all about the length. By contrast, shapes, which we talked about for Project 1, are two-dimensional, they have length and width, and forms are three-dimensional, they have length, width, and depth. So lines can actually do a number of different things that are pretty powerful. We'll talk about a few of those now. First, and perhaps most obviously, lines can define shape and form. So they can create an enclosed space, either two-dimensional or three-dimensional, that sets off a shape or form from what's around it. They can do this either through an outline or contour. In other words, you draw a line around the edges of something to set it off from what's around it. Or they can do this by being built up to create a sense of light and shadow. So on this image on the screen, you see some hatching and cross-hatching lines built up to give a sense of light and dark, and therefore an illusion of form. In addition, though, to defining shape and form, lines can do a lot of other things. One that surprises a lot of people is that they can actually trigger an emotional or intellectual response in someone who's looking at your artwork. That always seems a little strange to me. It's like I don't normally look at a line and think, wow, that makes me so happy. But it does have a subtle effect. And it does so largely through something known as line quality. So line quality is basically the way we describe a line. And different line qualities can trigger different emotional or intellectual responses. So line quality, you can also think of it as basically any time that you apply an adjective to a line, you're describing the line quality. So if you say that line is jagged or that line is bold, those are all line qualities. We often discuss line quality in kind of categories to help us understand it better. So we talk, for example, about line length, whether a line is long or short. Line weight, whether it is thick or thin. This is also known as line width, but more commonly in art, line weight. We talk about line texture, is it rough or smooth? Line direction, horizontal, vertical, diagonal, and line curvature, straight or curved. Each of these categories can have an impact on your viewer. And what's interesting is they tend to impact in pretty predictable ways, which means that we as artists can use this in order to convey certain moods or meanings. You know, the line qualities that you pick can help support what you want to communicate in your artwork. So let's talk about some specifics for some of those categories. Line curvature, for example, straight versus curved lines. Here on the screen, you see two artworks with very similar subject matter. A still life drawing on the left by Picasso and a still life drawing on the right by Matisse. They were even made at similar time periods in the early 20th century, but they have a very different sensibility. So if you look at Picasso's on the left, what kind of mood does it give you? What does it say about what the artist might think about his subject matter or think is important to communicate? By contrast, look at Matisse on the right. Does it feel the same as Picasso's? I mean, I hope your answer is no. It's a very different sensibility, almost opposite end of the spectrum. But what kind of vibe does it give off to you? Take a couple seconds to think about that. So generally, straight lines versus curved lines do have very different emotional and intellectual influences. You can see things that are typically said about them on the screen. So straight lines, of course, are geometric and they're rectilinear, which means that like math, they tend to be more structured, more organized, sometimes even a little more rigid, more logical. These are all things that if you wanted to convey those sensibilities in your artwork, you might use straight lines for that. By contrast, curved lines, which are lines with a varying degree of arc, tend to be more organic, flowing, graceful, sometimes even welcoming. And again, those are things that you can mine for your artistic purposes. Let's look at another line quality, that is line weight, thick versus thin. This is one that comes up a lot, especially in drawing classes, and it will be important for you in Project 2. Again, we have similar subject matter, two figure drawings, but one with thick lines on the left and very thin lines on the right. What is the different sensibility here? Does one look more a certain way than the other one? What kind of mood do you get from each one? Take a few seconds to think about that. Some things people commonly say about line weight. So thick lines tend to have more visual weight. We talked about visual weight a lot with Project 1, so you're hopefully familiar with that concept. But perhaps because of a result of that, they are more bold, powerful, noticeable, and they're more likely to advance into the foreground of your artwork. By contrast, thin lines have less visual weight and they're more delicate, graceful, ethereal, and likely to recede into the background. Line weight can actually vary within a single piece. Actually, all line qualities can vary within a single piece of artwork, but line weight specifically is one that we concentrate on a lot because it does great things in terms of adding visual interest and even some spatial depth to your artwork, something we will talk more about in a few moments. Another line quality that has a great impact on mood and emotion is the directionality of lines. Horizontal lines, for example, tend to feel to people more stable, calm, reassuring, or static. And part of the reason that they do this is that we in our minds associate horizontals with the horizon of the earth, which is a familiar and constant landmark to most people. We also associate it with lying down, again, a comfortable position. So that stability kind of bleeds into how we interpret artwork that has a lot of horizontal lines. Vertical lines, these are more soaring, and because of that, because they lead our eye upward, we often think of them as being more ethereal. You'll see them in a lot of religious art, for example. And they're less static than horizontal lines, although they are still relatively stable because a straight up and down is still rather geometric. And then finally, we have diagonal lines. These are the lines that tend to be more energetic and dramatic, full of movement. I think when we talked about shape for Project 1, we talked about diagonal shapes being the party shapes, and the same thing is true of lines. There's a lot of energy in diagonal lines. And speaking of energy, that leads us to a third thing that lines can do. So again, we've talked about lines being able to define shape and form. We've talked about lines being able to create a mood or sensibility. And now lines can create a sense of movement. That's going to be pretty big for Project 2 as well. So let's talk about movement for a minute. Movement is one of our principles of art and design. So again, if you remember, our elements are our building blocks. Our principles are what we put together with those building blocks. Principles can help us create and evaluate a strong composition or artwork. So they're very important, but they're a little bit more theoretical. Movement is the principle that creates a sense of action in an artwork. That action might be a representation of actual motion, like the motion lines of the feet and the dog and the leash in the Spalla painting, or a kinetic sculpture that shifts with the wind. Or it might just be the way the viewer's eye is guided around an artwork. And this is the type of visual movement that we'll focus on more in this class. How do you get the viewer's eye to move from one place to another in your composition? Movement's really important because it helps engage your viewer in the entire artwork, and that helps keep their interest because they're moving all around and seeing different things. And it also allows the story or meaning of your piece to unfold, so they can start at point A, move to point B and C, and learn a little bit more about what you want to communicate each time. Now, as artists, we can control a lot about how our viewer's eye moves by just placing elements on our artwork in such a way that they establish kind of a path through the design. And there are a number of ways to do this. One way is to create a path of similar shapes, colors, values, textures, or other elements. So you're repeating things, which means that the eye will naturally jump between those similar things. So this little example on the screen, you see similar shapes at the top of the waves. Your eye tends to jump from one of those wave shapes to another one, which helps move you across the composition. Another way to make a path is to just create an illusion of 3D space in some way, something we'll talk about a bit more later in this presentation. But when you have a sense of depth in your artwork, your viewer's eye wants to move through that depth. And again, it will help create that illusion of movement. Another thing that you can do to create a path is to change the direction of things in your composition. So if something's going to the right and it shifts all of a sudden to the left, your viewer's eye will make that turn with you. One pretty simple thing that you can do to get some movement in your artwork is energetic mark making. Lots of brush strokes or textures or splatters. That helps the viewer feel the action of the artwork being made. It also often has directional kind of lines or shapes in it that allow the viewer's eye to move back and forth. And then finally, you can use what we call leading lines, which are lines that point the viewer's eye where you want it to go. Also a very powerful way to create movement. Here's a painting hopefully most of you are familiar with. It's Edvard Munch's The Scream. And Munch has used a bunch of different ways to create movement and allow our eye to cycle through this artwork. Take a few seconds to think about what you see. What do you think? How did he use movement here? Well, hopefully you can see that pretty much all of the ways we just discussed are represented here. Certainly he has created a sense of space. He's used perspective on the bridge to make it feel like there's a three-dimensionality here for our eye to exist in. He's also created a lot of leading lines. So you have the railings that kind of go past the foreground figure into the background and are picked up by the lines in the sky and then the lines of the water, all create kind of a cycle that your eye moves around. There's a lot of brush texture in here, mark making, that reinforces those leading lines. There are also some changes of direction. So we kind of go back around along the railing to the left and then come back to the right along the sky. And we also have some repeated things. So for example, the colors of orange and the railing are picked up by the colors in the sky, which helps our eye jump between those similarities. So lots of things in here help create a sense of movement, and you as an artist can mix and match in your own work. All of the elements of art can be helpful in establishing a visual movement, but line is especially great at it. And this is in part because our eyes do tend to automatically travel along the length of lines. We think of lines in our mind almost like directional arrows. And so we'll just follow them where they're going to go. That one dimensionality, that length only thing leads our eye. This happens in both 2D art and design. So this is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And you may have talked about this in another class at some point. If you look at the lines in the ceiling and the lines across the top of the tapestries in the background, all of those diagonal lines point right to the center and they converge right behind Christ's head. It also happens in 3D art and design. So here we have this sculpture that probably for most of you, you either start on the right where the man in the tan coat is standing and your eye kind of goes up over the arc, or you start at the left where the sort of flower forms are, and again, you still go up over the arc. You almost can't help yourself. The line just pulls your eye along its length. So in addition to defining shape and form, to creating an emotional or intellectual response, and to helping create movement, another thing that lines are really good at is creating a sense of space. They can contribute to the sense of space in our artwork. Now, you may remember that space is another of our elements of art and design. We define space in art as being the area in which the elements of your composition exist. Now, that's a really sort of nebulous and general definition, so let's drill down in that a little bit. We generally consider space in several ways as artists. First, it's the area between or around an object or objects. So you see this drawing of the ram on the screen. On the left is the positive shapes of the ram and the ground. And on the right, we have filled in dark all of the shapes or the space around it. So that's one way we think of space. This is important because it's tied into that relationship of object to surroundings or figure to ground that we talked about with Project 1. And that's really important to help create visual balance, to help create compositional interest. So that figure ground relationship or positive shape to negative shape and space, that's crucial. But it's not the only way that we consider space. We also think about space in artwork in terms of the total area of our design, the length plus the width plus the depth. That's really hard to say. The length plus the width plus the depth. Now, space in this sense as the total area, it exists in both 2D art and 3D art. But in 2D art, only the length and width actually exist. In other words, we can have real space along the length, real space along the width, above, below, to the sides of any 2D element, like a shape or a line. But if we want to have a sense of three-dimensional depth, we have to have an illusion of it because there is no actual physical 3D depth in a 2D artwork. Therefore, we typically say that depth in 2D art is implied. We have implied space. If an artist has chosen to imply depth, then you have to remember not everybody wants this. It's not the goal of everybody to create a 3D illusion on a 2D surface. But for those that do want it, there are a bunch of different techniques to fake it. Now, it is important to just note that by contrast, in 3D art, the depth isn't implied, it's what we call express. That just means that there's actual space in all three dimensions. So that's kind of the difference there. So here's the practical question. How do we imply a depth of space in our 2D artworks if that is our goal? Well, there are 8 ways that we can do this, probably more than that, but these are the main ones to imply three-dimensional space in two-dimensional art. You are going to get to use one or more of these in Project 2, which you will learn about on Monday. So the ways are to increase or decrease the size, to place elements closer or further from the horizon, to overlap elements, to intensify or de-intensify elements, to increase or decrease contrast, to add or remove details, to use value to create a sense of light and shadow, and to utilize perspective. Let's talk about each one of these briefly individually. So first up, we can create a sense of implied space or depth by increasing or decreasing the size of different elements. This should probably make logical sense to you. It's the whole larger things appear to be closer while smaller things appear to be further away. That's a thing that's very well understood by those of us in Western culture. Not all cultures understand space this way, but we do, mostly in the United States, and so we can capitalize on that as artists. Here's a painting by Edgar Degas, and hopefully you should see some places here where you have similar shapes or forms that just get bigger or smaller to help us understand that there's actually supposed to be a sense of space here. Can you see that when you look at this? If you can't, look at the forms of the ballerinas. Do you see how the ones in the foreground are much larger and the ones in the back are much smaller? You can also see this in the floorboards. The ones that are closest to us are much wider than the ones that go further back. So that creates that some sense of illusionistic space in this particular artwork. The next way to create a sense of illusionistic depth is to consider the placement of things relative to the horizon. Now, if you've had a drawing class, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of the horizon, but for those of you who aren't, it's the part of your drawing that corresponds to eye level. So for example, if you were drawing a picture of a cat and you were sitting so that you were looking the cat directly in its eyes, the line that passed through the cat's eyes on the drawing would be the horizon line. People often get confused by this because we talk about the horizon in the real world where the sun sets, and it's not always the same as our eye level. But good news for you all is this is really stuff that's mostly beyond the scope of this class. I just want you to be aware of that in any artwork, there's a place where we sort of consider our eye level to be when we look at it. And when we place things on the page relative to that imaginary line, they're going to appear to be closer or farther away depending on the placement. So generally speaking, things that are closer to the horizon line actually look further away, while things that are further from the horizon line appear to be closer. It seems kind of backwards, but if you think about it, when you're looking off into the distance and you see the actual sun setting horizon line, trees that are way back there next to that line are much further away than the ones that are way down in the foreground near where you are. Hopefully that makes some sense. The horizon line is often near the top of the page, not always, but often. So an example in a non-objective artwork, you could debate about exactly where the eye level here, but for me, I read the eye level as being kind of along that horizontal reddish, I don't know what you call it, kind of a trapezoidal shape towards the bottom. And that means the things that are closer to that, like the black circle, appears to me to be smaller, even though it's physically about the same size as the two lighter blue circles up above. Those to me come forward more than that black circle does. So again, you can mine this to your advantage in order to create a sense of depth. The next thing you can do, and perhaps one of the easiest things that you can do to create a sense of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional picture plane, is you can overlap stuff. If one thing is in front of another, we assume the thing that's in front is closer. So this Jacob Lawrence painting, for example, we have all of these groups of people. Look at the one kind of in the center and slightly to the right. The man in the black with the white hat appears to be in front of the woman in the green and red dress, and so on and so forth because of this overlapping. Another thing that you can do to create a sense of depth is intensify and de-intensify. Most commonly, we talk about this with color, but it could also be values or textures. Things that have more intensity to them as are read as being closer to us. This is related to a type of perspective called atmospheric or aerial perspective. And this is basically like when you go out and you stand out in the world and you look out at the mountains in the distance, the things that are closer to you, you can see a lot more detail. There are a lot brighter colors than the things that are way off in the distance, which appear kind of misty and washed out in blue. So things with more intensity we read as being closer. Here's an example with this Monet haystack painting. You can see the colors in the foreground haystack are much brighter and more intense than the ones in the rear haystack, which are kind of faded out, which helps us understand that the haystack on the right is closer to us. All right, number 5, we can change the contrast of things. So when you have something that's got a sharper contrast, that is to say, one thing is very different from the things that are next to it, we read that high contrast as being closer. This is also related to that atmospheric perspective because we see more in the things that are close than the things that are far away. The things that are far away are faded out. So this Katakovets drawing, we see the figure in the foreground. It's a very dark and intense in value compared to the white next to it. It's a super high contrast. The figures in the bed in the background are much more gray and much less in high contrast relative to their surroundings. So we tend to notice the figure and on the left and feel like it's more in the foreground close to us. Number 6, we can add or reduce detail. Again, this is all about atmospheric perspective and how we see more of things that are closer, but stuff that has more detail in it is understood to us to be closer. In this still life, you can see the peaches in the foreground. You can see all of the colors, all of the details and textures. As you go back to the back of the dish, we barely see just a filled in outline. Same thing with the grapes. The grapes in the foreground have every perfect highlight and every perfect shadow. The ones in the background are really faded out and don't have a lot of detail. 2 more techniques that we will not explore so much with this project, but you should be aware of them. One, you can do some shading. So shading is when you imply value or lights and darks in such a way that we simulate how light and shadow would fall on something. And this will fool the eye into seeing something that's 2D as being more 3D. Again, if you've had a drawing class, I'm sure you're familiar with shading. It's a great way to add a sense of depth. It is, again, though, beyond the scope of Project 2. And then finally, perspective. Perspective refers to a couple of logic or mathematically based systems for creating three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional surface. Perspective is really really dependent upon the artist's point of view, and it is pretty complicated. So there's two main types of perspective. We already talked a little bit about atmospheric. There's also something called linear perspective. That is far beyond the scope of this class. If it's something that interests you, I recommend you take Drawing 1, where you'll learn all about linear perspective. In a nutshell, it relies upon converging lines to create a sense of depth, but it can get kind of complicated, and so we don't have to worry about it in two-dimensional design. If you already know how to create perspective, awesome, you're welcome to use it in things, but if you don't worry about it. So here's an example of a painting with some linear perspective in it, just to give you a sense of how that works. Actually, a little atmospheric perspective in here too, as the things in the background are more faded out. Now, most of the time, artists who want to imply three-dimensionality on their 2D surface use a combination of techniques. So take a look at this artwork here and see if you can spot at least 3 ways of the ones that we just discussed that this artist uses to create a sense of depth. What do you think? Well, from my point of view, there are a number of things happening here. For example, this sort of jig-jag line that makes its way all the through here is much bigger on the left-hand side than it is at the center right, and I read that much bigger line as being closer to me. What else do we have going on here? There is a lot of intense texture in the foreground that gets less detailed and less intense as it goes back along the course of the line. We have a lot of places where things are overlapping. The line, it overlaps itself. It also overlaps these kind of spherical forms in the background. The spherical forms themselves have some value applied to them that makes them look a little bit more like 3D forms. Maybe many other things going in here as well, but hopefully you picked up on a few of those things that give this more of a sense of three-dimensionality, even though it is totally 2D. All right, that was a lot of information to throw at you, and it is all important stuff for our second project in two-dimensional design. So I just want to review the high points. Line, it's one of our elements of art, and among other things, it can define shape and form, create an emotional or intellectual response through line quality, create a sense of movement by directing the viewer's eye, and contribute to a sense of space. We also talked about movement, a principle of art that provides a sense of action in an artwork. We're mostly concerned about moving our viewer's eye around our composition, and we can do this by repeating elements such as colors, shapes, textures, or lines, by creating an illusion of space, by changing direction, by making energetic marks, or by creating leading lines. We also talked about space, which is an element of art that refers to the area in which an artwork or design exists. This means that we consider both the relationship between positive shape and negative shape or space, and we also create an implied three-dimensional depth some of the time. If we're interested in creating implied depth, we can do this by changing the size of things, by placing things closer or further from the horizon, by overlapping, by increasing or decreasing intensity, increasing or decreasing contrast, adding or reducing detail, using value to create a sense of light and shadow, and or utilizing perspective. Ultimately, this is all important because the way we juxtapose lines, spaces, and other elements in our artwork, that's what helps us create a dynamic composition that has a strong sense of movement, that's interesting to look at. So these are really important things for us in 2D design. It's important in particular for Project 2 that you learn to make smart choices about line. This influences space, it influences movement, it influences the overall success of your artwork. So a few tips: make sure you're choosing lines that help organize your design by moving the eye around the composition. Consider how your lines help create space. Choose lines that have a quality that supports the mood or meaning you want to convey, and make sure every line you add to your composition adds to your idea rather than creating a distraction. In class on Monday, you're going to see the guidelines for Project 2 and some examples of what other students have done for this, and then we're going to be delving into it. So it's really important that you understand these concepts. These also apply to one of the homework assignments that you have for this week, the lines in space. So read over that assignment post and do your best to apply the different types of 3D illusion to your little drawings. If you're really struggling with that assignment, you can bring it into class on Monday and we can talk about it. It's not due until 11:59 that day, so you have a little bit of time to work on it and get some help. All right. So if you have any questions about this, either save them up, bring them to class on Monday, or you can also shoot me an email. I should note that BB Learn messages are not sending me an alert. So oftentimes have not been noticing until a couple of days have passed that somebody sent me a message through BB Learn. So if you want to be sure you get a hold of me, shoot me an email. Other than that, I hope you have a great rest of the weekend. I hope everybody's healthy and well, and I will see you on Monday. Bye.